Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, I've covered a fair number of books so far. In fact, I think by the time this video drops, I'll be somewhere around like well, technically, somewhere around 55 to 60 videos. A number that, one, quite frankly, astounds me, largely because I don't feel like I've covered even half of the books that I absolutely adore and want to talk about on this channel. And I haven't even talked about Sandman and Fun Home yet. Yet. Stay tuned, it is in the works. But along with that, one thing that I've kind of observed is that I haven't really done a lot of manga on the channel. And that's something that I'm keenly aware of and something I'm honestly a little ashamed about. While I may not necessarily be the most manga-obsessed human individual in the world, in fact, for the most part, I can take or leave manga. At least in my experience, I prefer stories that begin and end. I'm not terribly interested in exploring a character through 30 individual installments of a book. Sometimes 40 installments, sometimes Bleach level books. It's sometimes just the sheer volume of material that can take place in a single manga is a tad intimidating. And also, how exactly am I supposed to expect to hold anybody's opinion for like 200 videos? He said, wondering about the long-term prospects of his, YouTube career. But I am thinking more and more about the manga that I have covered, which at this point I think is like one or two books at the most. And actually, in fact, I was looking the other day at my library, and they have the Mobile Suit Gundam Origin series, volumes like 1 through 12, I believe, which I would actually really love to do and talk about on the show, because I've actually done something similar on my blog, White Tower Musings, and, well, anyway, ideas are in the works. I'm constantly thinking of stuff for this channel, and also trying to, find time for my art, and also try to, just live in general. But what does this long, boring monologue have to do with anything? Well, the focus of today's video is in fact a manga that I read last year, and I absolutely adored it tremendously. And I bought it largely because it explores two topics that are extraordinarily important to me: depression and homosexuality. Being a queer man, it's really hard to find books that just explore queer identity. Now, that's changing, thank goodness, day by day by day. More and more queer cartoonists are coming onto the scene and making wonderful comics. Likewise, when it comes to the issue... My dog's barking at the neighbors again. When it comes to the issue of mental health and depression, it's really, really, again, difficult to find books that explore the topic in and of itself. There are aspects in other books where depression is sort of touched on here and there, but it's never kind of the sole focus. So how exactly do you find a book, then, that explores depression, homosexuality, and it also happens to be a manga? Well, you read this book here, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness by Nagata Kabi. Now, note, the artist of this book is Japanese. I've studied a little bit, solo un poco. That's not Japanese, that's Spanish. But I've studied a little bit of Japanese, so I feel pretty solid in my pronunciation. But, as always, wow, my dog is in a fit. Please always take into account I grew up in East Texas, so my pronunciation of Asian names and languages is going to be not that great. Anyway, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness is a book that just crossed my path because, full disclosure, sometimes I just like to Google search LGBTQ plus graphic novels and see what comes up. That's one of the things that led me eventually to Steve McIsaac and Unpacking, his beautiful book, which I've covered, by the way, on this channel. You should definitely check it out along with the rest of the books that he's composed and working on. And I may or may not be Instagram friends and talk to him on a semi-regular basis, which is just so freaking weird. But anyway, just Googling queer comics led me originally towards this book. And at first it seemed like, okay, this was just going to be kind of a exploitative manga, but as I actually bought it and read it, I began to realize, holy shit, this book is really good and has a lot that registers to me personally. And so as I was sort of approaching the next video to do, I've got, as always, a big stack behind me that I want and need to do, but I thought, you know what? I want to do this video, or I want to read and cover this book on my channel. So I reread it again recently, and so I thought it'd be fun to talk about it here, especially as we're nearing the tail end of 2020, and if there's ever been a better book to talk about right now, it's probably this one right here. So let's get into my lesbian experience with loneliness and talk just right off the bat, what exactly is this book about? Okay. Long introduction aside, one day I'm going to find some sort of fun, concise little way to start each of these videos up. But again, as always, it's me just kind of rambling into a camera, hoping that somebody finds this and enjoys giggling at me. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about how I actually found my lesbian experience with loneliness by Nagata Kabi. As always, if you see me doing this, it's nothing. I honestly forget who wrote these books sometimes, a lot of times, almost all the times, and so if you see me doing that, I'm not going to try to find some cool explanation for it. I'm a dork. I read too many books. Anyway, it's important going forward for my viewer to recognize and remember something here. As I'm fond of reminding everybody, I'm a cisgender white man from East Texas. So, explaining the complexities inherent of being a young lesbian Japanese woman, I'm never going to be able to do it. So when I approach this review and I talk about it, please understand I am never going to be able to confirm that this is, the standard norm. What I can do is speak from my own research into the realities facing individuals who live in the country of Japan, conversations I've had with people who have lived in Japan and have observed the culture firsthand. Anyway, it's important to recognize moving forward, this is a good book, it's a solid book, but I am obviously not the subject under discussion. Which is another reason why I really wanted to talk about it, because, again, the complexities of being a lesbian in Japan, a country that still to this day still has difficulty recognizing the legitimacy of homosexuality, is an important thing to talk about. And so, when we talk about my lesbian experience with loneliness, we have to understand right off the bat, it's kind of difficult to see because of this pattern structuring here, but she notes this is a true story. My lesbian experience with loneliness is effectively a sort of memoir. It's a biography about Nagata as she was sort of trying to live her life. The book primarily deals with her as she's going through about the year age 28, and she's kind of observing a trend in her life, which is that she suffers from hunger issues. She suffers from food ingestion issues, specifically just trying to keep food down and not throw it back up. Now, the primary focus is not necessarily bulimia, and she doesn't qualify herself as such, but she does observe that she suffers a great amount of depression, and that manifests a lot in overeating and then undereating a lot. Add to that, we see her as she tries to hold steady employment, first in terms of part-time jobs, full-time jobs, at first really trying to look for something in her fellow employees that, realistically speaking, is probably just not going to develop. We see her in this panel here kind of observing how much she really enjoyed and loved her coworkers and how much she wanted them to like her personally. But then as more and more of her life began to sort of implode, we began to see her, as she represents so beautifully in this dramatic panel, basically what was happening was that she was becoming more and more, not disenfranchised, but distant from her coworkers because of aspects of her depression. In fact, the first 3 chapters of this book, her homosexuality doesn't even really come up. It's hinted at here and there, but for the most part, my lesbian experience with loneliness is really her exploring how her loneliness and her depression impacted her interpersonal relationships to the point that she virtually had no friends in her life, or at least no consistent friends, the way it impacted her career, and the fact that she worked a lot of small, short-time, part-time jobs that didn't necessarily pay well and ultimately always ended either in her termination or her more or less just abandoning the job itself. The book then follows as she moves in with her parents and finds even more alienation as she's constantly trying to make her feel her parents' approval. And that's something that, as Americans, or as a citizen of the United States, I feel, but I recognize that there is a cultural distinction there. It's really difficult for citizens of the United States to really buy into, because while the family unit is, for the most part, one of the bedrocks of most society, we have to understand that Japanese individuals, there is a culture that's intimately dug into the notion of the family and the notion of approval and honor. It's something that really defines your consciousness. And so, as Nagata discusses the notion that she's constantly feeling like she's disappointing her parents, that in turn is only fueling her depression. And then finally, the book kind of culminates with her realizing, you know what? I've kind of always found myself attracted to women. I would like to have some kind of experience with another woman. Specifically, I would like to have sex with another woman, because at that moment, she had never had sex. And take into account, at the time she's writing this book, her self, or at least her cartoon self, was age 28. So she had gone almost 30 years without encountering anything in the way of sexuality, period, let alone exploring her actual sexuality. So in this way, we see the book is her story of attempting to overcome her loneliness, her isolation, and then in a lot of ways, her tremendous perception of self as something that is unlovable or ultimately a failure in and of itself. And this is one of the things that I feel is really important to talk about, especially when we talk about depression itself. One of the things that I've observed in the way that my depression manifests is there's a consistent perception that I am unlovable. No matter how many people in my life tell me, Jammer, you're really great. Jammer, we really love you. Jammer, we can always depend on you. Or just, Jammer, you're a decent human being. My brain struggles with reconciling that, and I am sort of constantly dogged by the notion of, oh, they don't really mean it, or perhaps they're just saying that to make me feel better, or maybe they're just saying it right now, but ultimately that's going to change. And hopefully that resonates with somebody who's watching this video who suffers from depression. Because that's one of the reasons why this book resonated with me. No matter how much Nagata tried to interact with people, no matter how much she tried to please her parents, it never felt like enough. And one of the most awful parts of depression is the fact that no matter what you do, no matter what you accomplish, there is continually, doggedly so, this perception that it's never enough, and that ultimately you have to look outside of yourself for satisfaction, confirmation, and validation. And so one of the most interesting things to me about this book is the way she manages to explore the notion that looking to other people as a means of curing depression is probably one of the greatest fallacies you're ever going to experience in life. The book ends with 2 chapters in which Nagata goes to what's known as a love hotel. Now, it's important to recognize that we're not talking about sort of a traditional conception or traditional cultural conception of prostitution. What we're talking about here is a very specific cultural institution within the realm of Japan. A love hotel is what most people would probably recognize as sex work. You're effectively paying to spend an afternoon with somebody with the understanding that, sexual relations are going to take place. Nagata goes, she hires a female sex worker to spend the afternoon with her. They take a bath together, they kiss, and ultimately sex is had by the pair of them. Also, sex is had being quite possibly one of the most awkward ways to describe lovemaking in the history of ever, and I apologize for it. And we see one of the interesting things about it is the way she manages to sort of use color as a way of showing the experience. Now, I'm going to get into that more when we talk about the formalistic aspects of it, but hopefully you can see I'm holding off some of the more racier bits in the story, but the point is that she doesn't hold anything back. We get a pretty graphic representation of sexuality, and ultimately in the story, Nagata comes away from the experience still feeling like a failure, but then also recognizing that that failure has illuminated the central core of her problem, which is, to quote my therapist, the call is coming from inside the house. By the end of this book, Nagata doesn't necessarily completely overcome depression, because you never do. As somebody who suffers from this crap, you're never over depression. You just handle it, day by day by day. And by the end of this book, Nagata doesn't necessarily stop being a lonely individual, but she does manage to find some conception of herself as a person by reflecting on her experience, coming to sort of a new level of just general self-acceptance, and realizing that, yeah, she's not going to have all the answers and things aren't always going to be perfect, but that the way that she's going to overcome these problems in her life is ultimately by accepting herself. That is a really long explanation of what this book is about, but it's important to talk about because I really wanted to explore, just generally looking at the meat of the content of this book, how it really manages, I would argue, a really great way of handling and addressing the issue of depression. And so, if you're somebody who has depression, or knows somebody who has depression, or is married, or is a parent to somebody who has depression, I would really recommend you to pick up a copy of this book because even if you are not gay or don't know anybody who's gay, actually, I guarantee you probably know somebody who's gay. Okay, honey, we're everywhere at this point. All right, okay, just letting you know that. Anyway, this book is worth your time, not simply for the way it manages to sort of address the issue of homosexuality and how it can impact the notion of self, but really more than anything else is how it explores the reality of living with depression and how that shit can sometimes ruin your life, but ultimately it's the strength of your will to overcome these obstacles. All right. With that understanding set in place of what this book is actually about, let's hop into formally why I think My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness is interesting at a formalistic level, and why I think it's a really interesting addition to the medium of comics. Okay, so I've now talked about what exactly is My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness in terms of the content of the story. What is the reader expecting to get in terms of the narrative approach to it? Now, we've talked about the content or the meat of it, but I should also, as always, discuss why I feel that this book is really good to talk about in terms of the medium of comics. Because we have to remember, again, as I'm ever so fond of reminding you, comics is a visual medium. It works with a combination of words and images to create communication, to communicate ideas, to communicate feelings, to just tell a story through images. And for the most part, we also need to understand as well that My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness is a really good exploration of minimalism. If you take a look through just this two-page spread, you'll note you're looking at 8 panels at the most. For the most part, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness doesn't do too much playing with panel layout and design. Nagata Kabi tends to lay out a lot of pages where you just get a lot of these long, horizontal, rectangular panels that work their way down. Now, occasionally you will have some pages where she will sort of break up the energy by taking up a little bit more space here and there with panel layouts. But looking at this book, just from a formalistic perspective, there's not that much emphasis on play or experimentation in terms of the panel layout. And at first, that may not necessarily sound terribly interesting, and there may be at some times a kind of monotonous feel to it. All the same, reading this book never felt terribly boring, largely because of this one subtlety, which is using the using the effort of white, black, and pink. Now, this is something that may sound a little familiar because we just explored it a little bit, don't forget, with Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me. Like My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, this book did a lot with using just black, white, and pink. Some of the most dramatic instances of this book are pages that are nothing but black, again, using the pink in order to really emphasize the world while letting the black and white create the world. My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, again, sort of employs that same effort. The color pink is constantly being used as a way of enforcing or bringing attention to certain areas. We'll note in this one particular panel here, while she's sort of perceiving annoyance on the part of her coworkers due to her behavior, due to her lateness, she presents herself here with sort of small splashes of pink, not really going to a lot of detail. Whereas here, this coworker has been painted entirely in pink, letting us sort of latch onto it more. Scott McCloud talked a little bit about it when we did our multi-part series, Understanding Comics, and he brought to the attention the fact that color can really make or break a panel in and of itself. Largely because we have to remember, when you're talking about just black and white, that's something where Black and white can become mildly iconic, whereas color gives it an entirely new dimension. Looking at just those two panels there of Scott McCloud, the black and white image of Scott, he appears kind of iconic, almost symbolic. Whereas in this panel here, my brain immediately perceives him as a real living object. That's because color impacts us on an emotional level as well as on an aesthetic level. And so Nagata Kabi is really good at employing pink in this book continually over and over again to draw your attention to the color and draw your attention to the people. So if we look here again at this one single panel, at this moment, the perception of her co-worker's annoyance, she fills the character in with color. That's because at that moment, her co-worker is assuming more realism or more real being to her than her notion of herself. She's reducing her own color and giving more color to another character to sort of emphasize the fact that at this moment, she's feeling really embarrassed and, more importantly, tremendously ashamed of her behavior. It's a little thing, but it's something that Kabe manages to repeat over and over and over again. Now, again, like I said, she uses pink for the most part sometimes as a kind of framing device, sometimes to just sort of break up the monotony of the black and white, but repeatedly we see the use of pink as a way of creating an emphasis on certain moments in the story. I didn't make this, age restricted, so I'm not going to be able to really demonstrate it here. But what's important is this use of pink in the story is really emphasized later when she goes to the love hotel with the sex worker, and we see multiple instances in which her partner is portrayed in solid pink, or that the room is solid pink, and she herself is still reduced to black and white. Again, when we look at her conception of herself as unlovable and ugly, we observe her depression in herself. That absence of pink is really important. That's why later on in the story, afterwards, when she's had the experience, when she's reflected on the experience, and she's sort of come to the realization of what she needs in life, we see one later panel here where the pink has kind of shifted. She says, "I think I know how to fill up my heart now. Transmitting my signal, having people receive it, being recognized by people." We see here one panel, and you'll note again, this is an instance where she's played a little bit with panel layout here. It's still a rectangular panel, but it is a panel that has been sort of two panels have been combined into one, bringing more extra emphasis to it. This is an instance where the repeated single rectangular panel over and over again is bringing our attention to when she changes things up. It's a nice, small rhetorical tactic, and it works. But looking at this panel here, you'll see again, we see her completely embellished in pink, and then this jar, which is supposed to sort of emphasize her sort of comfort with herself as well as her understanding in relation to other people, is filled with pink. Again, Kabe is using color in this very, at first glance, minimalist manga in order to really communicate how depression can kind of overwhelm you and leave you feeling rather flat. Again, it's a little method. It's a tiny method. But I think it's really interesting and really successful in terms of this book, especially in using the notion of color to sort of communicate her loneliness and isolation with another human being. I'm trying to see if there's another passage. Oh, okay, yes. So this is one particular scene I feel comfortable showing you because there's a little bit of nudity, but there's nothing particularly graphic. Again, Kabe's minimalist style really prevents us from moving into age-restricted territory like we did with Small Favors, per se. But you'll see again, the experience when she's with the sex worker, trying to sort of engage with the experience, wake up to her sexuality, we see again and again and again, the sex worker is portrayed solid pink, whereas she is black and white. It's a little effort, but it really demonstrates how she has sort of minimalized herself to the point that she feels almost nothing in this moment. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I felt that was really worth bringing attention to. But I suppose, for the most part, again, when we're talking about this book, it's a balance of black, white, and pink. But then, formalistically speaking, the minimalism itself needs to be explored because when we talk about manga, there's usually a very sort of definitive or recognized style. That's because manga is, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, a genre of art that is comparable, I would say, to ancient Egypt. In ancient Egyptian artwork, individual style was not the norm. In fact, there was a monotone style that existed literally for thousands of years, and it was the cultural expectation that if you were an artisan, if you were an artist, you learned the rules of that styles and you conformed to it. Manga after manga after manga that I have read has, for the most part, a familiar style that most people would recognize. There are some notable exceptions here and there where an artist will kind of tinker with their own style and come up with something that's kind of visually unique. But most people have a conception, or at least most people have even just a passing knowledge of manga and anime, will recognize that when you're looking at a manga style, you're typically dealing with a very minimalist structure. Again, my lesbian experience with loneliness is largely an exploration of the self. It's largely written as a kind of journal or diary. And so, what's happening a lot of times in the book is you're dealing with Nagata's individual internal monologues, her conceptions, her ideas. That's going to be a very abstract reality. And so as she's seen here contemplating going to a sex worker, we don't get a detailed description or layout of the room. In fact, we don't really get much of anything at all. We get her body, this sort of visual metaphor for her mental health, and then that single question mark against all that beautiful cross-hatching, by the way, which I'm mildly jealous of. But you can see here again, just looking at this panel, or even almost any panel in the story, sometimes even the most detailed locations in the story, there's really not much of anything. If we take a look here, as she's sort of engaging, what was this specific? This went on for several months, so I went to a doctor for the first time in ages. This is a doctor's office. How do we know that? One, her words, but then after that, that's pretty much it. Again, she doesn't really give us a real living, breathing environment because it's not terribly important to her. This book is exploring depression, and one of the most obnoxious parts of depression is it can get a little abstract. You spend so much time in your thoughts, or at least I can communicate this from my own experience. Sometimes I get so caught up in my own thoughts and oftentimes my own self-loathing that sometimes the outside world just kind of disappears. And so I think what's really great about this book visually is the minimalism. One may just simply be just her own individual aesthetic. Some people don't want to fill up their books with lots of tiny little details. Robert Crumb, excuse me. Some of them just want to do a very basic style. But I think here, Nagata Kabi is using this basic style not simply because it's part of her aesthetic, but also because it's adding, again, rhetorically to the idea of what depression is. It's a minimalizing experience. It's your brain not working correctly and effectively minimalizing everything around you to the point that you're almost nothing but your own thoughts, which are predominantly negative. So, what does my lesbian experience with loneliness add to the medium of comics? I would say quite a bit. It seems to be very cognizant of what comics are, how you can use the medium, how you can use visual language to structure your book, to structure your comics, and it just offers a really good exploration of color. And so anybody who's even remotely interested in comics, interested in making comics, or even just talking about comics, really should take the effort to sit down and read this manga. It reads pretty quickly, like you could read it in an hour, honestly, but in terms of just the visual structure of my lesbian experience with loneliness, it's a seemingly simple book, but that simplicity, at least I would argue, reveals a real careful and concerted effort to explore what is depression, how does it manifest, and how can it ultimately impact your visual representations of yourself as you try to communicate your experience. Okay, wow, let's take a break and then come back, do the last hurrah, and then call it a day. Whew. Okay. What were we doing? Oh, right, wrapping up. Okay, so, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness by Nagata Kabi. This book is phenomenal. It really is tremendously wonderful. Huge book. Huge. I'm never doing that again. Sorry. But this book, hopefully, you've observed by now, is really interesting. Not simply for the way that it manages to tell a really interesting story about a young woman sort of conceptualizing herself in the midst of suffering from a seemingly unbearable fit and spell of depression, while also trying to reconcile who she is sexually and what she wants out of another sexual relationship. The identity of being a Japanese lesbian is a complicated one. And I think she does a wonderful job here of showing her reader, who may or may not be a Japanese lesbian. I was not one, so, this was an interesting experience for me. But it gave me an idea of what a homosexual individual may have to undergo, or what they may have to sort of conceive with on a day-by-day basis when living in Japan. And then, even if I can't understand what it's like to be a Japanese woman or a Japanese lesbian, what was really remarkable in terms of the content was just being able to see somebody else who suffers from depression, which may not seem terribly important, but again, one of the most important things about suffering from depression is making sure not to isolate yourself and making sure that you feel connected to another person. But especially in this age of COVID-19, holy crap, is that important. Seriously, you're not alone. People love you. So please, stick around. Go watch some more Netflix or whatever you do to fill your time up. I've heard the PS5 is coming out. Do that. Do the PS5. So content-wise, this book has a lot to offer. And then formalistically speaking, this book is really great for the way it manages to employ minimalism as a way of furthering the themes of alienation and isolation to a really great effect. Nagata Kabi is wonderful, and in fact she's actually written a sequel to this book that I haven't read yet, but I've really wanted to. So anybody who likes comics and just wants to explore the perspectives of being a woman from Japan, being a gay woman from Japan, being a gay depressed woman from Japan, or even somebody who just wants to try to read a manga that doesn't look like every other freaking manga out there, this book is for you, and I cannot highly recommend it enough. Seriously, take the time. You won't be disappointed. All right. I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for Laura Dean's being. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As for my lesbian experience with loneliness, I would definitely, as always, recommend you to check out your local comic book shop. More and more comic book shops in the United States are stocking manga because there is a general readership out there for people who really love and enjoy it. So talk to your comic book shop first. One, because they need the business. Jeff Bezos doesn't need another platinum hot tub. And then also, two, if they don't have it, they can probably place it on order for you. Just as likewise, never forget that you live in a world with public libraries. Yeah, anyway, you have a public library in your neighborhood, or you probably do. In which case, they may have a graphic novel collection. And if they don't, ask them for an interlibrary loan form, and they can probably get this book for you. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're enjoying these videos, that you want to see more, or maybe you just want to see me stumble about and be cute or funny or just weird. I don't know. It's the internet. People come here for all sorts of reasons. Whatever the case, please like and share and subscribe. It helps me. It helps you. It helps everybody. And, of course, again, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.